I'm Ethan, I love muzzleloading. Today we're doing something I've never done before. We're going to carve the stock on a muzzleloader kit. Right off the bat, I want to say that this is not a how-to video. I am by no means an expert. I recommend that if you're looking for an expert, to find a class or check out some of the DVDs from the American Pioneer video to learn from somebody who actually knows what they're doing. There are two tool groups that we're going to be using for this process: chisels and scrapers. All of my chisels are Swiss brand chisels. I have a number 1 palm skew, a number 12 palm V chisel, a 5/5 gouge, a 5/12 gouge, an 8/4 gouge, and a 1S/8 skew. For scrapers, I'm using 3 handled scrapers, primarily 1 flat, 1 round, and 1 very narrow flat. These are just traditional gun stock shaping scrapers. And then I have 2 cabinet scrapers I'm using for this process, 1 square and 1 that's a French curve-like shape. For miscellaneous tools, I'm using a single line checkering tool. And then you'll see me throughout the video using an odd-looking carving knife. This is a carving knife that my father has made. He uses a Mora laminated knife, grinds it to a much shorter blade specifically for carving, and then handles it in curly maple. I use this a lot in this video because it's very comfortable for me. It's a tool that I've used a lot. I have no idea how much wood I've cut with this knife, but there are a lot of instances where I could not think my way through using the chisel to make a cut that the knife just naturally did in my hand. Being a beginner here, I wanted to start simple and work my way towards the complex areas of this stock. So the simplest thing that I could figure out to do would be to start with the cheek piece on here. I've pulled a couple cheek piece designs and layouts from some contemporary builds that I've seen, and this process is pulled directly from a Kibler kit building class that I was able to watch with Wayne Estes and Mike Brooks. I'm making the initial line at the top of the cheek piece with that single line checkering tool, and then I'm coming through for the line below it, which is a boulder line, and I'm attempting to cut this straight through with a gouge. Now this ends up giving me a little bit more of a wonkier cut than I've wanted, but we'll go through and clean that up a little bit. You can see here I attempted to push the chisel through here. Looking back on it, I think I could have done a better job staying on the line or making a better line had I used a mallet to drive the chisel. I'm using a Swiss-made number 11 palm gouge for this cheek piece molding. Our first 2 cuts weren't perfect. There you can see a little bit of the wonkiness that I'm talking about. It's really not super bad. It does stand out to my eye, but we have the gouge line there on your left and the checkering line on the right, or now the bottom. I don't think it's anything that totally ruins anything. This gives us a little definition on that cheek piece. So then with a triangular file, I'm trying to come in there and even up those lines a little bit, straighten them up, and make them just a little bit deeper. We don't want to go too deep with any of this. A lot of this, to my understanding, is kind of the art of surface level detail and making it feel like it's part of the stock. But I am a little particular when it comes to straight lines, and so I was trying to straighten it up. I'm coming now in with a gouge, trying to clean up the outside lines of that lower line on the cheek piece. I believe this kit was a regular, maybe slightly fancy stock option from Kibler. It has some curl, but it's not his extremely fancy curled stocks. So it does cut quite nice, really, I think. It's not until we get into the behind the cheek piece carving that we really start to run into that curl a little bit and have to start compensating for it. So what I'm fighting here, not really fighting, is I got a little aggressive with a cut, so I've got a little tear trying to happen. And the cut that caused the tear was going this direction, so I'm cutting back towards myself very gently with this gouge, working to remove it. Now I'm going to be moving on to the next step, which is the toe molding on this stock. I wanted to have a nice molding line running from the butt plate up to the trigger plate. So I'm starting with a triangular file, filing a notch with my line into the butt plate so that my line can continue seamlessly through that butt plate. I think it gives it a nice look. Then I'm taking my small V gouge, that number 12 palm V gouge, and I'm pushing on that line all the way through. Again, I don't know if this was the best way to do this. I think I could have kept a more consistent line had I used a chisel and a mallet, maybe. But when it comes to the straight line stuff, I almost think a measured tool to scratch a line to keep that line equidistant and keep it even the whole time might be better. I did, though, enjoy trying to keep that shaving and make this as one long cut through this whole thing. I think that's probably a record shaving for me to cut off of any piece of wood I've ever carved. So we're coming up to the inlet here, and I'm rounding it off towards the front of the hole in the trigger plate. And that's just an artistic detail for me. I did sketch out a few different termination points for that line, and I liked it to the forward part of that trigger inlet there. From there, it's much like the cheek piece molding that we've done. It's just a lot of cleanup. I'm coming in and parts where I've ebbed and flowed away from my line. I'm trying to clean up those sides with that same V gouge. Again, I don't know if it's the right way to do it. I'm sure there's a better way to do it, but I'm kind of working through this with the tools that I have at this time. So I'm trying to even up the width of the line and even up the depth as well. Coming in with that checkering tool now, it acts almost like a sandpaper or a file in that line and really helps me even things up because there's no back and forth with that checkering tool. When you put it into that line that we started with the V gouge, it rides that line and creates a nice even section going down into that wood. I think the V gouge really helped. There's some other points that I've worked on this stock where I didn't have the gouge deep enough and my checkering tool wandered a little bit. So at least in retrospect, the V gouge line and then the checkering tool worked pretty well for me. I've seen some folks go in just with the checkering tool on their line and they're able to dig that checkering tool in enough to establish that line. So it's really just kind of what feels right. And really a lot of this was feel for me. Not that I know what feels right again, but if something didn't feel right, I'd take a step back and try something else. On the Patchbox side here now, coming in with that V gouge, I'm able to give you a little bit of a different angle on the Patchbox side as we run along that line. And I'm not using a lot of force here. This is a real gentle, really focused push through the grain. It's a real controlled effort. You can see my index finger on my driving hand bent in. That's just the pressure that I'm applying to that chisel to keep it where I want to, or try to keep it where I want to as we're applying this cut. There you can see I'm still having fun with trying to keep that shaving connected through that whole cut. And we're turning to the termination and cutting that right off. Back in with the checkering tool to even things up. I have my incandescent light on an arm there to try to cast a shadow so that I can really see that line, and I can really see the shadow that that line is casting. And it helps me identify the points where it's not as even as I would like it to be. At this stage, we have an incised line for this molding, but at the time of doing it, I wasn't sure that that's the final look that I wanted. So I moved on to working on our Patchbox thumb catch here. Again, this is a simple detail. I'm coming in with a rather large gouge, and I'm creating a stop cut, coming in vertically at the rear of the box with a curve that matches or tries to get close to the curve of the box itself. Using a deeper gouge here, I'm coming in with my mallet and I'm driving the center of that thumb catch back to that stop cut. If you're unfamiliar with carving, that stop cut is driven in vertically, and that literally stops my inline or my parallel cut from extending any further. So you'll see as that's driving, I hit that stop cut, and that chip can then break off. Just like that. It makes for a nice clean edge in your carving. You see a lot of figure carvers use that to use a stop cut, I should say, to establish like a nose, a brow, or a chin. Any hard change in shape or definition, you're going to see a stop cut used. Coming in with that shallow gouge and just cleaning up the edge of that stop cut. And flicking out anything that came off of there but didn't leave on its own. I have a bit of a triptych theme with the carving and design, so here I'm experimenting with a deeper gouge and creating a little bit of a triptych in that thumb catch. Whether it's drawing, painting, photography, carving, I really like contrast. So a lot of my carving on this piece is trying to figure out how much contrast is enough and how little do I need to complete the look that I want. It's been a few days now, and I've had an opportunity to think about the toe molding line that we had there, and I just wasn't happy with it as an incised line. I didn't feel strong enough, and the only thing I could think to do at the time was to come in and carve out some relief, I guess, in that line, rightly or wrongly. After that first morning of relieving that line a little bit, I felt that I had done the wrong thing. But you can't put wood back on, as my father always says. So I embraced it and we started to go with it. So I'm using that skew to come in here and remove some of that wood, much like I would with a knife, to come in there, and I'm just slicing off those layers, trying to bring the stock around and down into that molding line. You can see there that molding line is real wonky, and that's part of my desire and my decision into relieving it out. I knew that if I removed that wood, I would have another chance to even that line up, and I would be happier with it if I was able to do that. This is the palm skew that I'm using, and much like the palm V-gouge that we used to establish that line, these are very focused, very concentrated cuts. And with this skew, I want to pay attention, and I am paying attention to that grain. Skews, a lot of times, in my experience, really want to dive, depending on the wood grain that you have. And here in this buttstock, we have a little bit of curl, so that skew will dive now and then and try to pry up a section of that curl. So I'm really focusing with my driving hand and then that thumb on keeping that skew just below the surface, so that I'm just gently slicing off that grain. This initial pass is really about removing the wood and establishing that molding line as our high point. I'm going to come back through much like this cut that you're seeing now, and I'll even up that surface, but right now we're trying to establish that contrast so that we get that molding line looking right before we go further. There I'm using the edge of the skew to come in there and establish and straighten up that molding line where it might have been wonky. And this is also creating a stop cut there as well, which, much like our Patchbox lid, gives us something to kind of run up to and stop our next cuts. I really love a good skew. I think if you're a true beginner when it comes to carving, skews can be really intimidating, and they have been to me for years, but the versatility of them is just really unmatched. There's a lot that you can do with a skew that you could do with 5 or 6 other chisels, but man, a skew, you can just do it with one, and it's just a really great tool to have. It's a really great tool to try to get comfortable with. And after doing this kit and the mileage I got behind using the skew, I really feel a lot better about using skews than I did even beforehand. So it's definitely a tool to try and a tool to practice with. You could come in here with a flat chisel if you wanted, but man, being able to slice across the grain with the bevel on that skew really makes it a real power tool, I think, in my opinion, as a for what it's worth as a first time stock carver here. But I'm just sharing my interpretation of it and a little bit of the experience I had. A skew is a really great thing to have. Now I've switched to my full sized skew, It gives me a little bit more leverage, but importantly, it gives me more length. So I'm able to work across that cheek piece there and down into that molding line, where with that palm chisel, my hand was running into that cheek piece. So that's something that's handy. It's really the same angle and almost the same blade, but having that extra length of the full-size chisel allows me to work around some of the details of the stock. When I posted my initial designs looking for feedback about the carving as line art on the American Long Rifles forum, I got a really good comment back about drawing it on paper is one thing and putting it into a stock is another. And it's something that was really driven home to me working on this is, you can practice, and you should practice the drawing of all of this, because it helps your mind make those pathways in between and how your tools need to move. But there's a big difference in the 2D flat plane and the 3D stock plane. I mean, there's just everything that you need to learn or can learn, I think, about carving can be done on a stock. It just depends on where you're doing it. There's a lot of different things I tried to pull, or a lot of different work memories, I should say. I tried to pull from other carvings that I've done to apply to this, but I still had to kind of distort them to try to match with what the stock wanted me to do. This area around that plate inlet is really tricky. You have the grain is coming in and then going out as you go down the toe there. So I'm working through a little bit of that grain trouble, but just taking those gentle, even slices off. This up here doesn't have to have extreme definition, but I want there to be enough there that we get some cast light, or shadow, I should say. When it's done, we have a little bit of contrast once we get the finish on. Then back at the butt plate, I'm coming in with a flat file to try to clean up the areas near that butt plate, because I don't want to get my chisels anywhere near that brass. Brass is soft, but I really need these chisels to be sharp. And keeping on the wood is really the best thing I can do for them, steering clear of that metal. I'm back on the Patchbox side now, and I'm trying to figure out the direction the grain wants me to go here. So that's the reason I've inverted the way that I was working there, coming from the inlet and then coming back to the buttstock. This is sped up 500% here. Same process as the other side, but you can see back there towards my thumb where we've had a couple dives with that skew. So I stop at that point, I back up a little bit, and I start working my way up to that point where we've had that dive so I can slowly shave it away. I don't want to peel or pry that wood out. I want to step back and sometimes step in front of it and work my way back to it so that I'm gently slicing that out. Back at the butt plate with that file, establishing that nice curve so that we see that even in the butt plate. I think it's just a really nice touch, a nice detail to have. You can see we have a little nick there in the toe. It's really easy to ding this stuff. Using the palm skew here, but you can see how effective even that small blade is in removing that wood. Then in a couple of trouble spots here in the wrist, I switch over to that flat scraper. The grain in a wrist of a flintlock is really difficult to work around, especially on the underside here. So coming in with that scraper allows me to kind of work my way into the molding, or work my way into the grain, I should say, and accomplish a few things that were becoming difficult with a chisel. And I'm using that French curve cabinet scraper to come in and even out a little bit of that removed material that we had there along the toe. Really just targeting that peak from that wood we've removed, try to even it out a little bit. But there's quite a bit of work that needs done in that regard. Even that small notch, to get that to feel and look nice and gentle, we remove wood quite a ways up into the stock to make that right. I'm coming in with that V-gouge, that palm V-gouge. I think it's a number 12. Again, trying to clean up that edge a little bit. So I'm tilting this so that our point isn't going down into the stock, because I don't want to go deeper into the stock. I'm just using the side of that V. I'm running it flat in line with that molding to try to true it up a little bit. Then we're coming in with that file. You can see the two-tone difference in the wood that we've removed there just to the right of that molding line compared to the soft, even facet there on the right-hand side. That's the real advantage of having that low incandescent bulb in that workspace, I'm finding. Just like everybody says, you're able to see those plane changes and those facets in the stock, which become increasingly important as you continue to work these. There you can see that veiner, that V-gouge, coming in trying to clean up some of those wobblier parts of that molding. And there I'm back in with the scraper, evening that out. You can see that plane change here again. Now, I should have waited a little bit, but I was getting excited. I felt like I was making some good progress, so I started to work on the tang of this piece. My design, in retrospect, was a little too compact for my experience level, but I learned a lot, and I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. So I'm coming in here, initially establishing my main lines with my full-sized V-gouge. And this is an instance where I realized that in retrospect, I need to be more confident with these initial cuts. I was so nervous about messing it up that I was making these shallow, light cuts, and I really just made more work for myself in the long run. My pencil line is there, and I should have just dove in and cut it with purpose instead of this, I don't know, sheepish method that I was going at. It made for a dirtier, rougher cut that I had to clean up more, which led to more issues. but we get through it. So this V-gouge is, I've heard that since doing this, that you should use just a normal gouge for establishing these cuts. But I like the V-gouge because it's just so precise. I'm able to put that line right where I want to, the center of that gouge. I'm just following that pencil as I tap it through there. I'm excited to do a little bit more and learn a little bit more and more appropriately use the tools with some more purpose, if that makes sense. The tang here is really an area that I realize that duplicating a design across that center axis is a lot more difficult than I thought. On one side, I found that it was easier for me being right-handed to do it versus the other side. One side can work really well, and the other side is really difficult. It feels like you're just backwards the whole time, and that leads to some inaccuracies, we'll say, in the design through the piece. Just like our toe molding, I'm trying to maintain those shavings as long as possible. Maintaining those shavings isn't just a point of pride, it's a marker, I think, for yourself to know that you are matching the depth that you need and the pressure that you need to keep that going. And to keep that chip going, I think it's a sign that you're on the right track. And wasn't able to do it as much on this tang as I would have liked. I came up with this design inspired by several contemporary and original builds. I didn't feel like I could properly execute a nice beaver tail. That was one of the drivers on this, and to laying this out this way. Again, inspired by history, but putting a little bit more on it. But these little curves there around those scrolls, I wish I had placed those scrolls farther out wider. It would have been more comfortable to work. And here I'm bringing around the breech face, that curve. There you can see the primary lines laid out. Again, all with that V-gouge. And then I'm coming in with that palm skew. I'm starting to remove wood up to that line, using that skew to establish a little bit of a stop cut for that wood removal. And there I'm removing the immediate material. And then we'll work on kind of beveling it out so we have a nice, even approach to that carving. As a beginner, I found myself wanting to not necessarily work up to that carving in a flat plane, but kind of dive into it to increase that contrast. And it's something you'll see in a lot of beginner work like mine. But that skew, again, allows me to come in and really level that relieved area or that recessed area so that it comes in nice and gradual and flat, and we don't have a dive as we get into that curve. There, coming up to that breech face, I've got a small gouge, and again, we've sped up here about 500%. Coming up to that breech face, that grain gets a little funky for that skew, and coming in with that gouge allows me to remove that material effectively, but it also allows me to not tear or mess up that grain. I didn't want to come in there and chip that front end of that carving out into that breech face. I could remove a little bit of wood, but I couldn't repair a major chip in that area. So we're coming back to that scroll here now, and this is an area where I should have kept to my design. I end up losing that small triangle in the carving just from my own inexperience, but we're using that curve, or that skew, sorry, to remove some of that material and gradually bring that wrist up to the level of that carving. There you can really see the contrast between the wood that we've removed in the wrist and the rest of the wrist. You can also see a great example here of that skew conflicting with the direction of that grain. And that lock side of that molding was very difficult because that grain just wanted to dive right in, or that skew wanted to dive right into that grain. And it caused me to go a little deeper in relieving the back end of that tang than I wanted. So that's something to keep in mind as you're working on something like this. It looks a little crazy how I'm changing that skew back and forth almost with every cut, but that's just in response to the grain that I'm interacting with as that wrist slopes down into the crest. On this tang carving, that side plate side was much easier for me to work being right-handed and with the direction of the grain. So you see me focusing on that area quite a bit just because it was a lot easier. And I come in with a bit of a larger palm V there. And then with a scraper to even out a little bit of that material that we've removed in the wrist. Again, we want nice gradual transitions into that carving. Coming in with that V gouge here, establishing that line. Looking back on it, I really went too deep in this area. It's really not in a bad spot based on the originals that I've handled. You don't need a whole lot here. You just need enough to get a little contrast, get a little shadow line in there. But I really got a little off track, we'll say. Here using that small gouge to remove that material up to that stop cut around that curve. Then using that same gouge to clean up the ends of those cuts by coming around that curve. There you can see the depth between our recessed background and the top of that tang. My thought process was I'm most comfortable on the side plate side. I want to get this side plate half of this Tang carving established so I can use it as a model for the lock plate side, where I'm going to be dealing with being a little bit backward handed as I work with the grain. By focusing on this side, I kind of got an idea more so of what movements I needed to make the cuts that I wanted to make. I think for carving like this, I should have, looking back on it, done a duplicate carving, made up a stock, or found a busted up stock somewhere that I could use as a practice carving stock, just because you have so much happening in this wrist area. I've talked extensively now about the grain, but you have these complex curves going in both directions. It really makes it for a little bit of a mental workout. I came to the shop each morning with the goal of listening to some music or a podcast or something as I worked. But I found, and as you can hear in the video audio, that I couldn't listen to anything. I had to be mentally focused so much that anything playing audio-wise was just a distraction that became irritating. But it was really nice to kind of buckle up, really, and focus on one thing like this for several hours at a time. I'm using my friend, the red pencil, in between carving sessions to mark areas that I'm seeing need to be reduced or modified to better match things. The way I work on these is I'll work for a couple hours in the morning until my wife and daughter wake up, and then I stop and go spend time with them and go to work. That time I find away from the bench is really good because my brain can rest and relax, and I'm able to process things differently as I come back. So typically the same day after a carving session, I would stop back in the shop when I closed up my chickens for the night, and I would assess my carving for that day. And that's when I would mark out those areas that need to be cleaned up or removed or adjusted in some way. Because I'm coming back to them with a relatively fresh head, but my mind still remembers some of the work I did that day. So now we're on the lock side. You can see with that inlet there, working on removing that material, just like we did on the other side. With that side plate side established, I have a reference and I have a guide that I can work to for my depth and for my shape and for my material removal. So I recommend trying to do that. I really do try to bounce around a composition or a canvas depending on what I'm making, so I don't get too focused on one area and overwork it. But being a beginner stock carver here, it really was nice to have that other side done so that I could go back and look at it. struggling with that grain coming off the end of that curl. I really don't want to tear that out, so I'm coming in with those scrapers from the reverse direction, the opposite direction from where I was cutting, to just work those fibers down so I can just gently pull that dive off. And we're coming back in again with that number 12 small V, just cleaning up that surface, that vertical surface of that cut. Looking back on it, I think I probably should have stopped using the V in this area and just worked on bringing the top surface down gradually. As you can see, I have a nice dark shadow here. But in a lot of the originals, you don't necessarily see that much contrast. You just have a nice even transition down into that shape. So there I've just marked a kind of rectangular area, we'll say, that needs some material removed, and I'm coming in with that narrow flat scraper. I'm using the narrow scraper here because I'm less likely to run into that scroll carving farther down the wrist there. Getting to the point now where I'm trying to preserve that wood, and everything gets smaller and smaller as you carve. Every nick and every ding takes out a section of wood that you really need, especially when it comes to those small scrolls. So using that narrow scraper, see there, I've just bumped into it. Using that narrow scraper, I'm assessing my disappointment in myself. Using that narrow scraper helps keep me away from those. As you can see, it doesn't totally prevent collisions, but it does help. There I'm slowing down as I get closer to that curl and working my way around it. So I've got my depth pretty well established here. I'm coming in with a gouge, and I'm establishing some of the veins in that leaf motif. And I want those vein lines to come down and basically bottom out with the top of the exposed wrist that we've recessed away from that tang. That way that the tang carving ideally looks and feels like it's kind of just slightly grown out of that wrist. These leaves or these veins are another great example of me wishing I had come in with confidence rather than hesitation. I think I should have been able to lay them out better than I did, and coming in with just confident strokes, I think would have helped me there. So then I'm coming in with that V gouge, and that is really just changing the shape of those veins a little bit. We're taking some angles out of each of the sections of that leaf area just to give us a little more definition. You can see there we have some bright triangles facing the camera and a little bit of a dark peak on top. That's just giving us a little bit of a triangular shape to those that we're going to work down, but keep some of that definition in there. Now I'm to the point where I can't keep ignoring those scrolls on either side. So I'm coming in with that V-chisel, that veiner, doing a couple more defining cuts on that before I come in and start adding more detail. It's then that I make the decision, rightly or wrongly, to remove those triangles. My goal with those triangles forward of those scrolls was to keep that indent around that tang from being so sharp that it was hard to clean out. It was still pretty difficult to clean out, but it wasn't as bad as I thought. But, you know, it's kind of one of those hindsight's 2020 things. It's something I will really think about tang carving moving forward and how I lay it out, is those scrolls become very dangerous, very hairy to work around, because you're just so cautious and so nervous, at least I was, about knocking them off or just splitting them right off. So here I'm coming in with a rather deep curved gouge, a narrow gouge though, and I'm establishing a stop cut at the center of that scroll so that I can work down into that stop cut, defining that scroll as it rolls around and terminates. That stop cut helps me keep from going across that scroll and, for instance, carving the bulb where I want to carve the stem as it wraps around. So I'm able to run the end of my tool into that cut and know that I'm not going any deeper into that bulb where I could mess it up. Coming back in again. This is our full-sized skew, cleaning up a little bit of the hairy texture that we have going into that scroll. Slicing across the grain, removing some of that wood. Shallow gouge and into the skew, further cleaning that up. Then I'm using a larger palm V tool there, coming in and establishing that vertical a little bit more. And here I've got that palm skew, and we're defining a little bit of the shape of those leaf sections. So I'm carving them out at different angles, leaving a peak in the center of each section that will work down slightly to round them out so they aren't so pointy, but still retain some of that definition. I'm trying to work broad, and then as I work, the longer I work, get more specific and more specific with those cuts. So there you can see a little bit of the light reflecting from those veins and how that changes as we go across those leaves. At this point, I'm feeling a little flustered about this tang carving. I've time to the point where I got stuck. I felt stuck, and I wasn't really sure what to do. Consulted my father, who's done a lot more carving than I will probably ever do, and he's given me some tips and some pointers, and I've shared a couple different angles of the carving with some friends in the long rifle community, gotten some tips and some ideas on what we need to do to continue this. It's nobody said it was ruined, which is how I felt walking away from it here. There's just a few more things that we need to continue on doing. The first here we're going to do, and you might be able to see it a little bit, is we're going to work on this surface here in the wrist. Right now we're coming up the wrist and we're diving into the carving. We don't want that. We want that to be a nice even approach to that carving. The next thing is I'm fairly deep in my relief on all of this, and you can see I've worked our floral area here just a little bit. What I want to do is I want to bring this down. I've reliefed this just a little too far, and so my goal is to come in here with our skew chisel and just start angling this a little bit, bringing it back down more to the surface that we've taken away here. And we're going to be working on the approach of the wrist to the carving from a few different angles here to work out those dives that I've got in there. But from what I've been told, that's a beginner, common beginner mistake, so it's nothing to necessarily feel too bad about. So the last thing I did was I came in here and I worked on my flutes a little bit, put some angle on those. I should not have used the V-gouge or the V-chisel to cut those flutes. I should have used just a normal round bottom gouge. So we're going to continue to work. We can't really put that wood back in. So we're going to bring down a little bit of these edges like I had talked about here, and we're going to work on our approaches and see where we're at after a couple more hours here. I think after a little bit of work here today, I'm going to pause on the Tang carving and we'll move to our scrolls on our cheek rest side. I chickened out on jumping back to the cheek piece carving, and we started to work on our entry pipe carving here. I want to have a nice molding running along our ramrod channel. I want to have it terminate in this nice flowing curve. So I've cut the curve with a small gouge with my mallet, a full-size gouge in my mallet for better control. And I'm coming in here with my carving knife, and we're removing or relieving that background away from that curve so we have some nice definition. This is another instance of my handedness helping on one side and hindering on another. I feel like my side plate side looks a lot better than my lock side. I have a little bit more cleanup to do on my lock side from this same carving, just because the directions change up enough that it became difficult, as odd as it sounds. But I'm using the carving knife here, much like I do the skew, where I'm just using the blade to cut across that grain and just relief small sections at a time, coming into those little inlets and just scraping just small layers of that grain up and out. And there I'm using the palm skew in combination with that carving knife to work on the termination of those swirls. This is another area where it's really easy to have a sharp dive into your reliefed areas, but we want to have a nice, gentle curve into those areas. So I'm spending a lot of time working in the inlet or in the relief and then back up out almost towards the barrel. There you can see a little bit of the contrast as I'm working that section as we wrap up to the channel with that knife. Just gentle, ever so slightly scraping. We're removing a little bit more wood here as we drop down into what will be the ramrod channel molding there. But we have quite a bit of material there swelling off of that entry pipe area. So we're removing a little bit of that. It's giving us some nice contrast, I think, though, on that front curve, which accentuates a little bit of the diffusal of the relief on that curve. So that front curve looks a little bit deeper than the rear curve does. It gives us a nice gradual change there. This detail is nice and simple because we can come in with a couple different sizes of gouges if we need to, and we can clean up the peaks and valleys of that carving. Again, if you were to come in here very confidently and make a very clean cut the first time, you wouldn't have to do all this cleanup. So that's something I'm going to be striving for in the future. Coming in here, trusting myself, trusting the lines I've put down, and just cutting them. Now you can see I'm removing a little bit of that contrast of that front peak. I'm rounding out each of those peaks that go up towards our sight, as you can see there, just to give them a little bit more of a feel that they are just part of that stock. They're just growing out of that wood. The contrast is still there. It's still there, especially as we go down into the valley of each step. But those peaks being pressed or cut back into the stock gave them a nice little look. I can't tell you what led me to doing that. It was just kind of off the cuff as I remember, but I was looking at it and I was thinking, we need a little bit of a change in definition here. And so we just kind of sliced off, beveled really the top quarter of each of those peaks, and I think it came out looking a lot better. The carving knife is really handy for an area like this because we have a wider blade than that skew. So I can span across multiple of those peaks and I can cut them to the same level all the way across in just a simple single cut. Completing these on either side, I spent a couple weeks away from the stock, away from the kit in general. I just wanted to be in the right headspace before we moved any further. The carving at the fore end and the rear of the cheek piece is really, apart from the lock, the main focal point of this stock. So I wanted to come into it with the right headspace. I'm coming in here forward of the cheek piece with our V gouge and my mallet, and we're cutting our primary lines here out of these scrolls. With a single cut, I move forward from the cheek piece. I wrap it around to, half of that final terminating scroll. And then I come back and finish out that scroll going the opposite direction. I do that just for comfort on my working end. I tried to come around to the other side of the stock, to the crest there, and working it from that end, but it just didn't feel right. I wasn't able to rotate my body the way I wanted to complete that curve appropriately, at least in how I felt. So I'm doing it from two different directions here, but I'm happy with how it turned out, and I'm happy with the motions we were able to make making those cuts. I mean, A lot of this can feel like it's an end of your arm, it's a wrist and your fingers motion, but the scrolls that I really liked how they ended up on this piece, I cut them twisting and turning my whole body so that my body was working as one. As kind of silly as that sounds maybe, but everything I was doing with my body was working in line with these lines to cut them the way that they need to be cut. And really these front scrolls, I think, are some of the best of the whole piece, really. I was really pleased with how they turned out. Then I'm bringing that bottom scroll up into that top scroll, as you can see there, terminating it behind the rest of that scroll. Working similar processes in different locations, I step back behind the cheek piece and begin cutting the primary lines using the same method. So I'm using that full-sized V-gouge with my mallet. This time I'm coming in very confidently along my line with purposeful strokes. Here I've backed up and I'm coming from the opposite direction. Coming around the top of that curve is very difficult because your chisel starts to run in line with the grain, and it really wants to go places. No matter how gently you tap, that chisel's ready to run right through that grain. So you want to be careful as you're doing that. Cutting the rear curve here, that rear scroll is that primary, and I'm bringing it around very gently. I don't want my chisel to run into that butt plate if I can keep from it. I've cast my chip aside. Coming around this area here, I'm deep enough. I'm not too worried about maintaining that curve. I just want a nice confident line. And then my secondary scroll, I'm coming in. I start maybe a half an inch up into the main scroll and come all the way down around, cutting the second scroll. I find that has given it a natural flowing feel rather than just starting the second scroll where it looked like it needed to start. By continuing that up around the whole scroll, gives it a natural flow. From there, I'm doing some gentle cleanup with that skew, working on some areas here. We're coming into that straight grain where we're coming in line with that grain. Got a little funky, so I'm using a combination of stop cuts and that small V chisel here to clean up that arch so we don't have as many large flat spots. It's not a perfect curve, but it's a curve. Then using a small narrow gouge here, the smallest from my tools list, creating a nice deep stop cut at the end of those scrolls that I can work into to define the ends of those bulbs. You can see I'm pressing in and setting the stop cut, and then I'm rotating that chisel a little bit. And that chisel, even though it's set into that wood, it will rotate and cut, creating that stop cut, making it a wider cut if that's what you're looking for. So I'm coming in with that large V-gouge again, using it to concisely really relief material around those curves. That V cuts on that V, and that gives you a lot of relief very quickly around the ends of those scrolls. So back up here at the front of the cheek piece, we're doing the same thing again, where I have that small narrow gouge and creating those stop cuts at the end of those curves so that we can preserve those bulbs. We want to maintain those until the very end where we begin to remove material. At least in my experience on this piece, that's what worked well. And then, like everything else, we're coming in, I think we're using the carving knife here, or maybe the skew, and we're relieving some of the material underneath that scroll so we have a nice cast shadow line. Now you can see I'm using the carving knife blade working around the back end of that lower scroll. And the grain is very delicate there. We kind of a straight line grain there, and I tried to do my best to cut perpendicular to the grain, so I'm just shaving off thin layers at a time. That way I don't have a risk of a run out when I'm cutting. And I found that it worked well for me to relieve material going around the scroll from its widest point to its narrowest point, kind of with the flow of the scroll. That worked well for me. As I was working this, I got the idea that I could make it look like the upper scroll going more in line with the wrist was on top of that lower scroll. So I'm removing material here, keeping that in mind, where I want the uppermost scroll to be a little bit taller than that lower scroll, so we have a nice flow between them. And here I'm dealing with some of the same wrist material removal that we were dealing with the Tang carving, and I'm just continuing that removal on the opposite end and just finishing out that nice taper into this scroll and into that toe molding there for a nice even finish. Here we're taking out another one of those bevels or plane changes with that carving knife, just using the end eighth, maybe quarter of an inch of that blade for a lot of this work here. That fine point lets me get in between those scrolls and those creases, and I can get right up against that curl without going into it. It's just really effective. This is the carving knife I use for 95% of the other like figure carving that I do. It's just a really, I love that knife. I've cut a lot of wood with it. And a lot of these really delicate cuts where we're moving up against small need to preserve details. If you watch my hands, you'll see that my right hand is more or less just driving. It's aligning the tool, and then I'm pushing it to actually make the cut with that left-handed thumb. That gives me a really stable interface. I've got my left hand on the stock, kind of supporting it. Just real gentle pressure with that thumb, with support from that right hand, allows me to make some of these really detailed, smaller cuts with some confidence that I'm not going to ruin anything by splitting out or going too far. Taking it to 300% speed here as we start to remove some more of that material. I'm getting it to a point with this scroll that I like the definition that we have. I'm just trying to blend that background out. So we have a nice even transition into it. And we have a transition out of that scroll into that background. The same thing there along the top, coming off the top of that cheek piece. I want to have a nice transition as shape flows past that scroll and really into the crest of the stock. Bringing that small narrow gouge again. We've got our stop cut, and then we're applying some definition to the ends of those scrolls here. I tried applying that definition with the skew and with the knife, but I just wasn't happy with it until I got that small narrow gouge in there and kind of cutting with the curve and with the shape that you want that curve to be in all dimensions. That gouge really comes in handy, and I was worried about the gouge leaving marks and not coming out to be flat enough, but I was able to flatten out those gouge marks quite a bit, which made it really nice. That gouge, I used the skew a lot, but I think there are a lot of instances where I should have used the gouges more, just as an effective means to remove material efficiently. Spending a lot of time out here on the front, but it just it kept flowing, really. Everything seemed to work pretty well with those scrolls, and I didn't want to stop and leave anything behind while it was working. At this point, I'm feeling pretty comfortable with those front scrolls. I want to take a break and try a little bit here at the rear. Coming in with the pencil to mark the areas that I want to remove. I wanted to make sure I had the definition right, so I really didn't want to mess this up. The primary scroll is more obvious than some of the smaller scrolls there at the bottom. But I'm coming in here with the skew, kind of cutting across the grain to establish that initial definition like we have with a lot of the other cuts that we've made on these kind of scrolls on this piece. This design was heavily influenced by one done by a Woodsrunner kit, I should say, done by Brian Barker. He had a nice, I think, bigger primary scroll flowing off of his cheek piece, but I really liked how Brian brought that scroll in and wrapped it underneath that cheek piece, so it flowed just right out. The definition you had from the cheek piece just continued into the scroll. So I borrowed that rather obviously here, and I really like that nice curve down into that cheek piece. Again, I want the transitions and the definition here inside these scrolls to be smooth. So I'm coming in and establishing the depth with one cut, and then I'm evening out with the next cuts as we work farther and farther back from the scroll line. Back to using that narrow gouge again as I work in and work on defining these scroll ends. I'm coming in radially around that scroll end with that gouge, just working my way down into the stock so we have nice contrast at that termination point. Doing the same thing on the back end of that rearmost scroll. I want the shape of that stock to kind of come down into that scroll termination, almost back to the point in height of that inner scroll there. So we have a nice even transition in depth back through there. Now here I've got that same narrow gouge and we're cleaning it up. And here you can really see with that light, those radial cuts I was talking about going down into that scroll termination. You can see how those lines radiate out around. That's all from that gouge coming in there and defining that depth, as well as that transition to that depth. Now we're bringing that skew in here. We're working on bringing the transition from that toe molding up to the lower parts of that scroll system very gently. So we have the lowermost point in our scroll relief as well as our toe molding, and we're trying to bridge that gap in a nice even manner so that when we tilt this in the light or when we're just looking at it or running our hands across it, we don't have any weird plateaus or shelves in that transition. And here you can see I'm penciling it in to forward of those scrolls. I have a bit of a hump as we wrap around and go under that cheek piece. And I don't want that. I want the level inside of our scrolls to evenly flow down underneath our cheek piece and then into the wrist. That material removal and transition I didn't think a whole lot about. I didn't really notice it as a thing that we would have to do until I got to this point. And I was looking at it and rotating it and feeling the wood, and I just thought, man, this doesn't feel right. It feels like we have a bulb, we have a bump back in here, so we've got to remove some more wood. This is another area that caught me off guard. I think, spend as much time on cleanup of this rear scroll as I did the entirety of the Tang carving. And I felt that the Tang carving was a lot more complex, but you have so much space here and you have so many different plane changes in this area of the buttstock with It's something that I thought would be a very simple design to kind of blow in here and move on. I ended up spending a lot of time on it, getting the definition right. But I think that time did pay off. And again, this is an area of the stock that oftentimes is the focal point of the entire composition. You'll see original pieces out there that the locks are unadorned. The Patchbox is a really simple Patchbox. It might be metal, it might be sliding wood. And there'll be very minimal carving around the entire piece, but this area, the rear of the cheek piece, will have carving. It will be a note that somebody along the way said, this is a canvas that we need to add some detail to. So I really wanted to take my time with this area and make sure that it was right. These are simple scrolls, but in that simplicity, I think they can show a lot of mistakes, as mine do, but I think I eliminated some of those mistakes. Behind those scrolls here now, working on relieving some of that material so that we get down to where we are matching that toe molding. If you look close down there, just above the toe molding there, you can see a little ridge where we have a change in the light as it's cast across the stock there. And that little ridge needs to go. That little ridge is holding us up, and it feels like a little bump there that shouldn't be there. Here I'm coming in with that skew along the back side of those scrolls where we relieved a bit of that transition with that gouge, just using that skew to clean those gouge marks up a little bit, even things out. You can see we have a bit of a dip as we go down into that bottom scroll, but I kind of like that look. It gives it a little more definition, and I think it's a nice detail to show a little bit of plane change there. Like I said, this design was kind of laid out to be mostly incised lines, and I ended up taking it to the relief. I think the incised lines look simple, but I think that they really show the mistakes, and I think they show that lack of confidence in my initial cuts. I think on future builds, I think I could focus more on incised lines with some more confidence in those cuts. I'm back to using a narrow, shallow gouge here, working on that transition from the inner part of our scroll underneath that cheek piece, and now we've jumped up to and on top of those primary scrolls, just working on that transition from that cheek piece into the wrist. I've got a little bit of a snag there with the grain. It's diving a little bit as we start to go up that wrist, so I've backed away from that area, working on the transition with some very shallow cuts there. And then here in just a little bit, we'll come in from the opposite direction and just peel that chip off and totally avoid that dive. So we've got the carving knife there. We're just running along that, just very gently, just cutting from the opposite direction and just slicing that chip out of there. Oh, that's the skew. And then with that skew, we're kind of establishing a little bit of the exterior from that curve, just making sure we have a nice clean cut there. There, the grain dove a little bit, so I switched positions and came in from the opposite way. Here I'm trying to use that skew underneath that cheek piece, but I find myself running up against that cheek piece and actually marring it a little bit. You can see how behind my skew it's become a little fuzzy, that bottom line there. Just got a little too aggressive with the skew, not paying attention to what I was engaging with the rest of the body of the tool. So I come in from a little bit farther behind here. The angle is not as good though. I'm still getting shavings, but they're a lot shorter. So I changed things up. I jump back to the scrolls with my carving knife, take a little bit of a break from material removal, and I start to define those bulbs at the end of those curves or the end of those scrolls with that carving knife. And there I'm just using the very tip of that blade. I don't need much, but that nice kind of sharp tip there at the end gives you a lot of tool to work with, especially on small details like this. My goal here with working these termination points is to make them bulbous. I don't want them to be a full round, but I want them to have some definition. And I'm working on kind of slicing material from around the outer edge all the way around until we interact or engage with the rest of that scroll. And then I come in a little bit higher on that cut, and I kind of half that edge again. And I repeat that process until we get a nice kind of center bulb at the top and in the center. I find too that this gouge works pretty well for this as well. I'm able to rotate and turn that gouge to remove that material in a way that doesn't cause hard, rigid lines like the knife or the skew can. At this point, I'm in the zone for these bulbs, so I take the carving knife up to the fore end, and I start cutting those bulbs on those scrolls there as well. I think if you really knew what you're doing and had good access to the scroll end, I think you could probably cut those bulbs in like 6 or 8 cuts, but you would have to really know what you're doing. So here now at the fore end of the cheek piece, I'm noticing that my depth that I'm bringing from the rear forward doesn't quite match with the depth that we have established on these fore end scrolls here. So I'm working on adjusting the depth of these scrolls and the recessed background to match. Here you can really see the curl in the butt stock there. It's not as obvious as other curled stocks out there, but you can see how that grain ripples in there. It makes it very difficult to come in here with this skew to remove that. It did not look that curly when we were initially working on this, but I think we're going to have some nice pops in here when we get ready for finish. So I'm trying to balance working up into the scroll and working down out of the scroll. I take a detour now and then to clean up a little bit of these scrolls, and then I start to mark around where I'm feeling or seeing layer discrepancies that I want to even out. Using the full-length skew chisel here, I begin to bring that bevel from those termination bulbs, bring that around the rest of the scrolls just to give it another light reflection area. I find that looks a little bit better than just having a hard creased line there. Here we're using that same shallow gouge again. We're cutting across the grain, kind of working our way down into that main interior scroll. By this point, it's time to, I think, kind of give it up on a lot of the chisels. So I start to bring in that French curved scraper, trying to even out some of that grain structure that we've been battling with here. That grain gets really ripply back in here, and that scraper really helps us to even things out. And then as I get closer and closer to those curves, I switch to a smaller tool. I don't want to bulldoze over those curves. We have nice definition on them. So I'm using this smaller flat scraper to come in here and work around those curves and work up to them. You can see here that grain as it ripples through, as well as some of the divots that we have in there that we're starting to try to even out with those scrapers. I'm sure it is possible to over scrape, but I do find that it's difficult to. I'm finding that I can scrape quite a bit. Like you can see here, I'm even scraping over the scrolls to flatten them out a little bit to give us a little bit of reduced definition there, but not to the point of overdoing it. It's just kind of beveling those edges a little bit, which I think gives it a little bit more of a natural look. I wasn't happy with this scraper in this back end here, so I popped that skew back out. Try to work up to that toe molding there before transitioning here back to the scraper. And then back to our skew. I wanted to have a nice overlap here between these scrolls, so I needed to get in there with that skew and just reduce a little bit more in between them to really make those pop. I probably could have left it, but about half of that point going back there was a different height than the material below the scrolls, and I figured we'd gone this far, so I may as well remove that last half inch of wood, making a nice even transition. For my final height reduction here below the cheek piece, I start coming in with the skew, but again, that grain structure gets to be pretty tricky, and I'm not getting the traction that I want. I'm not getting the finish that I want. So I begin to transition here into a shallow gouge that I start running with the grain underneath the cheek piece here. And this allows me to remove a lot of material very quickly. And I have a relatively even finish. I have gouge marks in it. As you can see there, we have those single lines running through the width of the cheek piece really. But as you'll see here in just a little bit, I'm able to scrape those away rather quickly. And I've switched to a wider, shallower gouge to clean up some of those narrow gouge marks here. But it really makes for quick work to get that cheek piece where we want it to be height-wise. That shallow gouge doesn't want to dive nearly as much as the skew does, and just seems to glide right through that grain. So it really worked a lot better for this part of the process more than the skew. Again, I'm still a big fan of the skew for its versatility, but coming in here with this shallow gouge, I was able to work from the cheek piece down into the toe molding, and it was very effective. Coming back to the rear of that cheek piece, I wanted a nice solid line there. So I'm using that skew, I believe it's the skew, to come in there and really define, nope, it's the carving knife, to really define that curve so I can work up to that stop cut and have a nice contrast there. I want that to drop a nice curved shadow as we flow up into that scroll. So we've got to clean that up. Then I can take that shallow gouge and I can work from the interior of that scroll down into the underside of the cheek piece and really complete that transition all the way up to and through the wrist. We have to do a similar transition on the Patchbox side, but it will be a lot of the same techniques with that shallow gouge and then a scraper, as you're seeing here, to clean up those gouge marks. Now I'm stopping my scraper short of that toe molding because I don't want to chip or round it out any more than we already have with all of the work that we've done here. But we'll come back in with another scraper and even out that bevel. So that wider, lighter area that you see underneath the cheek rest has been scraped. That darker area down by the toe molding has not yet. And it might not seem like that big of a deal, but that kind of transition will show in the completed piece. You'll be able to see that facet there, and it will detract, in my opinion, from the beauty of the piece. Now I've got that square scraper and I'm pulling up from that toe molding so we can't run into it and cause any trouble. It's not as effective as I would like though, so I come back in with that gouge, that wide, shallow gouge, and I'm able to really clean up a lot of that transition, I think, that way, without detracting from the look of the piece. When I'm doing all of this at this stage, all this scraping and all this cutting, I'm really thinking about how it's going to look when it's finished. Because it looks nice and white now, but as we apply finish and as we rotate it more in the light, it's going to look a lot different if we're not careful. So here we're back up at our tang. I'm just working on a couple small details. Again, I've been away from the tang now for a couple weeks, so returning to it now with fresh eyes, I can start to complete some of the thoughts that we'd started earlier on. So I'm beveling out some of the hard edges. We're shaving ever so slightly off the back of that point just to bring it down more casually into that wrist. And then we can come in with our scraper, work on that transition a little bit. Again, this is all down to your personal taste and what you're looking for. I'd like to build a few more muzzleloaders similar to this. I'd like to do some more carving like this. And so I'm kind of taking this as a learning opportunity to see how far I can push myself and how well I can make my first one look. And then I can kind of go from there. Again, this was a huge learning experience for me. There are things that I would have done differently, things I wish I could do over, but you've got to make those mistakes and you've got to do it before you know what you can and can't do. In total, I think I had about 40 hours in the carving to this point. That's an obscene amount of time if you talk to a real professional flintlock builder out there. I imagine they can do this carving in a couple days, if that, really probably a couple partial days. But being my first time, I really went slow and I was very deliberate and very patient with the time that I was spending on this. I learned a lot, and I think that the next kits that I build, I'll be able to go through similar carving a little bit faster. Not that I'm trying to rush it, because I think for me at this point in my life, it does feel nice to slow down and really focus on something like this carving. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done on this carving, but we're getting into the kind of subtle tediousness of it. I'd have a lot of cleanup to do around just about all of the carving to make sure that we don't have any odd facets where we don't want them. And you'll notice that I did not include the ramrod channel molding. I'm going to be approaching that with the same process as we did the toe molding. And I didn't feel like it made sense to replicate or that carving action in the video because this video is already so long as it is. I hope this video helped you a little bit. If nothing else, show you how simple carving can be. There's a lot of really nice, really gorgeously carved muzzleloaders out there, but nobody that makes those or has made them throughout history started making them that beautiful. When it comes to muzzleloader kits, one of the main things I hear is about how intimidating it is to do anything else to the stock other than finish it, sand it, and put it together. Carving is something that a lot of people out there want to do. It's just a big hurdle. And if you made it this far in the video, you must be at least somewhat interested in carving a muzzleloading stock, in the artistry and the history of it. And I'm encouraging you to just go out there and do it. Get that practice in, start cutting those lines. It's the only way you're going to get better. You're going to learn a lot along the way. Please go out and do it. I know this build has been slow, but I've been trying to do a lot of different things with it. I'll have more still photos and writing to go along with this video at ilovemuzzleloading.com, where you can check things out and see a little bit more of the step-by-step progress if you're interested in that kind of thing. If for some reason this video ever disappears from YouTube, you can find it at ilovemuzzleloading.com or at our I Love Muzzleloading Gumroad, where you can purchase and stream a copy of this video for yourself. In purchasing the video, you're supporting the channel and supporting more videos like this that I can offer. Once again, I'm Ethan. I love muzzleloading. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you next time.